My name's Francis Spufford. I'm an English writer and a friend of Ken's.
And my name is Ken MacLeod. I'm a Scottish science fiction writer and a friend of Francis's. And we thought that what the debate on the independence referendum was missing was an English writer with a posh accent and a Scottish writer with some rather old Labour sympathies, letting people know what they thought.
Yes, we thought that was exactly what was needed. I should point out that my speaking voice is, though rare, the natural speaking voice of a small tribe of middle-class people down at the bottom right-hand corner of the island we all share, and I am an English socialist as well as a person with a posh accent.
I think, Francis, if you could kick off, as they say.
The reason I'm here is that I'm a Thatcher baby, and long ago in the 1980s, when I was an idealistic teenager, I grew up reading Alistair Gray. Lanark was one of the most important books I read for a decade, and as a result of that, I was always instinctively sympathetic to Scottish independence, particularly since I could see that Scotland was getting a especially raw deal under Thatcherism. And I was taken by surprise in the last year or so, as the campaign over the referendum geared up, to discover that I felt very strongly on the other side of the question, and that once I thought about it, I had far more of a stake in Britishness than I'd realised. That once it became real, once Scottish independence was no longer a rhetorical cause but a genuine possibility, that I discovered that there was a huge weight of feeling for me on the other side of the question. If you're Scots, really, why should you care about the weight of my feeling? In the same way, I could just cling to the knees of Scotland and say, please, please don't leave us. Don't leave English socialists alone with everybody else down there. But that seems like a pointless appeal to Scottish altruism. And what I really want to say is that I think the union serves us at both ends of our island, and I think it serves radicalism at both ends of our island too, in ways we don't easily recognise, because the symbolism of the British state is so elderly and monarchic and traditional looking that it's hard for us to see what else is going on there. It's hard for us to excavate the component of ideas in Britain. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Good. Shall I go on, do you think?
Do.
I could. I'm English. You can tell this as soon as you hear me open my mouth. And I like being English. I like the irony, I like the sense of humour, I like the landscapes, I like the Marmite, I like the familiar things that go with that aspect of identity. They're important to me. But they're important to me the same way that knowing who your grandma is important to you. When it comes to citizenship, I want my political identity to be based on something else. I want it to be based on a domain of ideas. I want it to be something that happens beyond and around all the particular identities that I have as a kind of a local person eating local food. I want to be part of a state which isn't just national. I want something with diversity built into it, baked in to the cake from the beginning. I want to be part of an Enlightenment project, and that's what the union is. Once you peel it out of its monarchic wrappings, the union, like the other union of the United States is an 18th century political experiment. It's a political unit constituted around an idea, not democracy yet, because that happened a bit later, but representative government. It was put together by England and Scotland together to give us the critical mass to fight a world war against absolute monarchy, which was the enemy of representative government then. And in the usual way of things, because once you start something, the dynamic goes on by itself and nobody knows quite where history is going to go, it became more than a convenience. It became a way of solidifying the project of being modern on this island. Modernity, not always a comfortable or virtuous state of affairs, but a mixture. Sometimes violent, sometimes radical, sometimes desperately insisting on its own continuity with the past to make people feel better about the fact that we're hurling forward who knows where. And the British modernity on this island was well, put it this way, I'm not entirely sure that I agree that we are always better together. Sometimes we're worse together. What we always are is more together. Our potential for everything is amplified and enlarged by being together. And if you go through the history of our shared existence on this island, for every triumph there is something ambiguous we have to lift the weight of as well. We destroyed feudalism and absolute monarchy together. Yeah, that's what died at Culloden, to the delight of Lowland Scots and the relief of everyone in England who was terrified that the Stuarts would come back. We let the genie of the Industrial Revolution out of the bottle together. We invented for the world the idea of the plenty that happens once Adam Smith's pin factory kicks into gear. And by the same action, we also invented the possibility of treating human beings as cogs in one of our own machines. If you were just proud of the Industrial Revolution, you'd be being proud of some horrible pieces of human suffering, but it's a piece of change. Together we bought and sold and traded and exchanged with every part of the world which our merchant ships could reach. We explored, experimented, discovered, made new a whole globe. But we also looted it wherever our guns gave us a local advantage. We fought fascism together. That we defied fascism at the midnight of the 20th century when nobody else was willing to do it. Something to be permanently proud of. There's a good case for saying that human liberty survived because this island survived. But since 1945, we've been willing participants in other people's imperial projects. Swings and roundabouts, shame, occasional bits of glory, things to be proud of and things to be collectively ashamed of. And that belongs to all of us. That belongs to the us constituted by the English and the Scots together. Is this really the end of that particular story? Possibly it is. The story's end. I'm a writer. I'm very aware of the fact that plots have closure. But I don't entirely believe it. Whatever the specific political forms that the Union or things like it take in future, I think that the 400 years we've spent together so far are an eye blink, and that the story of what we can do has only just begun. I think that global empire and industrial revolution and parliamentary government are scratching the surface of what we are collectively capable of. And though I'm trying very hard for the sake of my dignity not to clutch the legs of Scotland and say, please don't go, don't leave us, please don't go, don't leave us. Do the stuff that we can do together.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Francis. Like Francis, I come from the left, originally from a rather harder left than he does.
Soft parliamentary socialist over here.
Yeah. And I'm still interested, as he is, in radical possibilities in economics and politics and so forth. In practice, I just vote Labour because I know that radical possibilities need really solid grounding in possibility and fact and social science and economics and so on. And part of the crisis of our time is that the left in general, and indeed on a world scale, is going into the future as blindly as we all are. We are making our way in a world in which certain earlier certainties no longer exist. And also, like Francis, I have been surprised at the intensity of my own feeling of something that was very important to me being threatened by the possibility of the breakup of the United Kingdom. Now, let me say that the United Kingdom is a state and a society that has many things wrong with it, much in its past that we have still to face up to, that I think it is scandalous that we have not faced up to, but that we should not beat ourselves up over not facing up to. These are matters on which we have to take certain people to account, hold certain people to account. But we live in a society in which it is possible to do that. Having said that, I want to say that I think that the union is worth maintaining quite independently of what you think of the United Kingdom as a state, about capitalism, about imperialism, about the past, about royalty and Westminster and the establishment and all these things that people make such a great deal of, because these are not the same as the union. The union is, first of all, and most obviously, it's a single, seamless market. And this sounds like an awfully dry economic thing, but it isn't. It's a matter of not just the employers on whom we, unfortunately, but at the moment necessarily depend, having an open market to work in. It's also a matter of us and our children and our grandchildren being able to travel completely freely to any part of the country, get a job without the slightest difficulty. Now, if you have a border, we are told it will be a very small border, a very invisible border, one you'll hardly notice. But we can't be certain of that. It might be just a line on the map. It might be a bump in the road. It might be something more serious. We really don't know, and we can't, because we can't predict the long-term consequences of setting up a new state. And I am very happy to be in the same state as England. England, I think, although I'm Scottish, and you can hear from my voice that I come from the north of Scotland, that I've lived in various parts of Scotland, that I've lived in England. England is, as far as I'm concerned, part of my country. The capital of England is London. There are two English-speaking world cities. One of them is New York, the other is London. It's a great privilege, it's a piece of great good fortune to live in the same state as London. London is also, and quite remarkably, one of the most successful multiracial, multicultural capitals in the world. And England, as I know from having lived there in the 1970s and revisited it frequently since I left it in 1990, a society that's changed and improved dramatically on the questions about race and culture and nationality. And it has done that as a consequence of political struggles often conducted and led by radicals, by socialists, by liberals and so on, which at the time often seemed quite hopeless struggles, but which have nevertheless succeeded, because there is that open political space and that element of representative government, of democracy, for all its limitations, which is there to be used. I think that the unity of the British labour movement is a very important thing. It may seem a very weak thing at the moment, but it's better than nothing, and it's all we've got. And we know that things can change, that what seems like a quite weak movement, the fact that it merely exists institutionally, can matter a great deal in changed circumstances. Finally, the other thing which is was quite sobering realization to me was how much I feel I have gained from being in the same country, the same nation, as this enormous, deep, long-standing and rich English radical and democratic tradition. When I was a child, one of the alarming books I was given to read was John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. Now, Bunyan was a soldier in the English Revolution. You can tell that from his other book. People like the Diggers, people like Winstanley, the Levellers, Blake, William Blake, Thomas Paine, the Chartists, all of these English radicals have enriched both my own understanding of our history and our politics, and I think they have also enriched and shaped radical and progressive consciousness in one form or another within Scotland. We have the chance on September 18th of doing something great and something unexpected, and that is to reject the politics of division, of nationality, and to affirm a union. We're in a world in which states are breaking up, I think all too often, along lines that can't be justified on any progressive or democratic basis. Europe has various fault lines within it. You see quite dangerous and quite selfish, quite conservative, quite right-wing separatist movements in particularly Belgium and Italy. And these would only be encouraged by a breakup within Britain. But I think we'd also be doing something great for ourselves, for Scotland, and for England.
I agree, absolutely. And I will repeat back to Ken from the other side of our, at the moment, gloriously nominal border, that the tradition of Scottish radicalism feeds and nourishes the English too. That the Covenanters and Red Clydeside and Keir Hardie, thank you for him in particular, are part of my history. Not because I'm appropriating them, but because they nourished it, because they're part of the chain of cause and effect in a big island-wide British political culture which made the present. I don't want to live in a kind of narrow provincial England without Scotland. I don't want to live without the nourishment that comes with sharing the space with Scotland. And if Scotland goes, it isn't a question of leaving Britain, it's a question of dismantling Britain, because Britain is what the union between England and Scotland is. I don't mean to be rude to the Welsh here or to tidy away the awkward question of Northern Ireland, but at the heart of Britain as a project is an agreement between England and Scotland. The fully voluntary agreement in our history. Yes, voluntary in a murky 18th century sense, but one from which the polity has grown in ways that its 18th century founders didn't expect. I was reading the Act of Union on the train to Edinburgh this morning. It's a remarkably economic document. Just as Ken put the single market for the British Isles first, that appears to have been what people were thinking in 1707 as well. It's amazingly about tariff barriers. But the thing about open spaces is that they allow open possibilities. They are big enough for all sorts of things to happen in them. They are also big enough to do, this is where I speak as a lily-livered, woolly-minded parliamentary socialist, they are also big enough to do, with conviction, the social democratic job of talking back to capital and being listened to. Britain together has the critical mass required to negotiate, and I'd like it if we were doing it with the rest of Europe as well, but I'll take what I can get for now. Britain together has the critical mass to negotiate as if democracy mattered with the forces of economics. That seems precious to me. And, Lord knows, I can see the radical attraction of, seeming to get to start again next year. That's not an unthinkable millennium far away. It's not the socialist dawn of fantasy. That will be like 2015. That's next year. But there would be enormous loss of possibility as well as quick gain in that. I think Scotland and England would be dealing with the world on far weaker terms afterwards.
That's an interesting point about the flexibility and the capacity of the British state or of the Union to reinvent itself and to change over centuries. I've occasionally toyed with the idea that one of the most successful revolutionaries was William of Orange, King Billy, in the sense that this polity that was created in 1688 and 1689 in Scotland, and signed the same Bill of Rights and agreement, actually proved so capable of adaptation through centuries, and it was an arrangement that had been perhaps blundered into, as the English so famously do. They do things empirically, and allegedly, and
no, it's partly true.
It's partly true, I think, and it has proved capable of an incredible degree of change over the centuries while maintaining a recognisable continuity. And that's quite an unusual feature for a state, I think. There are states that have been seemingly immobile, and there are states that have been radical but quite short-lived. It's difficult to think of a parallel other than perhaps Holland, which has been doing it for longer, doing much the same thing actually for longer.
No, United Provinces, another polity with union in the title, which is always a clue that something is fermenting away there. I think the comparison with the United States is interesting. It would be easier to see the radicalism of our union if we had some kind of totemic founding object like the Constitution. If we had a man in a tricorn hat like George Washington. King Billy really doesn't do the job in terms of myth making. if we could point to that rather than to, kind of slightly rusty biscuit tins with the Queen Mother on the outside, it would be easier to see what is in fact the case, that the Union is this perpetually renewing box of possibilities. On the other hand, if we had the written constitution which hammered down and then riveted for all time the relation of the parts to the whole, we wouldn't have been capable of anything like the adaptation we've gone through. For example, we couldn't have done, at the drop of a simple referendum, the Scottish Parliament. We couldn't do institutional innovation the way we can. In some ways, the recipe for the British Union is terribly simple, which is just parliamentary sovereignty. The representative body gets to say what goes, and judges go, scrutinise it a bit. But on the whole, that allows for spectacular sort of bits of pivoting on a sixpence, historically speaking. Look at the way that the American Union is labouring state by state by state, painfully, through legalising same-sex marriage, for example. In Britain, House of Commons decides in favour of it. It's just the law. It happens. There is, as well as a conservatism in the British state, there is a built-in radicalism that goes with parliamentary sovereignty. And if the people will it, it can happen. That's the kind of space we live in.
Yes.
I should say if the people's representatives will it. I'm not
Yes.
trying to be some kind of happy English Pollyanna about the actual state of the House of Commons. But then the thing is that if you choose for the Union, you also choose for all the things the Union can become. And if you choose against the Union, you also choose against all the things the Union can become. The box of possibilities closes.
I think that's a very good point and well put. And one of the things that I think makes this a strong union is the way in which the British is actually a civic nationality. That's why it's so stupid and mistaken and misguided to try and create artificial symbols of it or talk about fairness or whatever. It's a project. It's a civic nationality. I think you're absolutely right about that. And that makes it very easy, or at any rate a great deal easier, for people who have come from outside, whether they're Huguenots, Jews, Afro-Caribbean people, Asians, Indians, etc., who have, and Irish too, who have, in time and again, immigrants have come to Britain, and specifically to England, have endured all kinds of racism, hostility, and so forth. And within a generation or two, at the most, they're British, and everybody accepts that they're British. Nobody has the slightest doubt that they're British. And in Scotland, there's a slightly different process, but people become Scottish.
Yeah.
Now, it's, for whatever reason, it's quite easy for people to come into Scotland and become Scottish, but it's not quite so easy for people who came or whose ancestors came from outside England to feel that they're English. But it's very easy to feel that they're British. And I think that's quite important in the possibilities of progress here, actually, and of having a decent life here, too.
Yes. British is whatever the British people decide it is, and is therefore ceaselessly changing. That's why the whole raise your hand in front of a Union Jack and vow allegiance thing is very un-British, actually, because it's not nearly open enough. I mean, the English are as prone to rancid, toxic, racist impulses as anybody on the planet. But that is held within this framework of citizenship, which is not ethnically defined. What is British is open. You can become it. You can alter it. You can become it and then alter it. One of the splendours of London as a city is that a Senegalese taxi driver who arrived 2 months ago is as much a Londoner and as much a contributor to what London is as anybody eating jellied eels whose ancestors have been on the banks of the Thames for hundreds of years. Stereotype alert. But sometimes it's easier to talk in stereotypes, to talk about kind of large, delicate things. There are differences of political culture here. And in some ways, the English, I'm sure if you're Scottish this is really irritating, the English get the Union on very easy terms. Witness the age-old ancestral confusion between being English and being British. English people use the two terms virtually interchangeably depending on where they are. It's sometimes seen, but there are shadings of meaning there. And from our point of view, being British is what prevents us from being stuck with being English and only English. British is the citizenship. It's the wider identity. It's the thing that changes. English is Marmite and bloody Morris dancing, which I don't do myself.
And I can't do a Highland fling either.
Fair enough.
Shall we turn it over to the questions from the floor now?
Yeah.
From our vast audience.
It strikes me one of the interesting things about the debate here at the moment is the way it's sort of cross-cut by attitudes to the EU. So a core part of the left would like to be out of the EU, some of the softer left and some of the smaller ultra-left groups are keen on the EU, and the EU is itself changing in nature. There's a lot of mythology connected with the EU, and you'll hear people claim that it prevented World War and all this sort of stuff, and it is changing dramatically now. The TTIP is on the way.
Mm-hmm.
The EU has taken part in and instantly accepted a coup in Ukraine. So what are your thoughts about the way the debate's sort of cross-cut by that?
I wouldn't necessarily accept your description of recent events in Ukraine, but I don't know. I'm in two minds about this. I would like to believe strongly in a democratic EU that was as open to definition by the needs of each passing generation as I think the British state is, in effect. It isn't that at the moment, and one reason why, looking on from the outside, I think that Scotland ought to be wary of hoping that the EU can take up the traditional function of the British state of being the kind of the large, friendly, democratic area within which Scotland can be Scotland, is that at the moment the EU's institutional arrangements are in a shambles. And if you think that negotiating with the Bank of England is going to be tricky, negotiating with the Bundesbank will be far, far, far worse, because what the EU has presently got baked into it is a particular inflation-hating, neoliberal-dominated view of how the world is supposed to work. And it is not responsive at the moment to public opinion. I say that, and the terrible ghost of Nigel Farage appears at my right shoulder. An English bogey, we're sorry we visited on the rest of you. But there are genuine reasons for thinking that Europe is not yet ready to do the job of union, of being the bigger space in which proper politics can happen.
Yeah. I kind of blanch at the thought of the kind of things that would be needed for Europe to become a demos, for Europeans to think of themselves as all one people. Let's not go there, shall we?
Oh, right, let's not. I'm only producing it as a kind of as a demonstration of present impossibility.
Exactly. Yeah.
Although it seems very relevant to what we're talking about here to insist that a demos can be constituted by ideas and by shared loyalty to ideas and experience. A demos does not have to be constituted by familiarity with the same soil. None of that blood and soil stuff.
Absolutely not.
Interesting point there. I hadn't really thought about it before. Why the nationalists are so keen to leave the United Kingdom, but they at the same time join another union which is far less effective. And why are they so keen, to join the EU? And I hadn't really thought about that in the terms of what, I just think of the EU as a kind of economic
block.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you think of it in terms of a union of states, you would expect the position, the yes camp to want to join the EU. But that's not. They're very clear on that is something that they do want to happen. And so it seems a bit strange, really.
Yeah.
I haven't really thought about it
I think it's because, at the moment at least, it's impracticable to be it is impracticable to be outside of the EU. Some people like Jim Sillert have argued for being in the European Free Trade Area or whatever it's called, and having a similar relationship as Norway, I think, has to the EU, which is a possibility. But part of it is that the SNP used to be kind of economic nationalists as well. When Scotland had huge heavy industry to protect, they were kind of protectionist, and so they didn't think very much about the EU back in the 60s and 70s, and it was Alex Salmond who came up with the idea of Scotland in Europe. And Scotland in Europe was quite an attractive slogan to many people at the time when it was launched. They were keen on the euro. They moved from having a kind of old-fashioned protectionist economics to having a neoliberal globalizing economics, and the EU is part of that. And it also, I think, part of its appeal is current political appeal right now, when the EU is not terribly popular in Scotland or in England, a little more popular in Scotland than in England, but not much, is that it gives people a sense of security. You're breaking apart from the UK, but you're still in a wider union, so you're not going to be this isolated little country on a choppy sea, which would have been a very, very tempting thing for the people who are for the union to point to, and which they used to when Scottish nationalism was all about basically repeating the Irish experience, but without the Civil War, as the gentleman in the audience said, it does cut across. It does cut across the debate in curious ways, but it's not I don't think it's necessarily a way that's easy for either side to make a great deal of use of, because both sides in the debate over the union versus separation, you will find different views expressed on the EU, as we have seen.
It's partly to do with mood music and poetics and associations, isn't it, as well as tangible political arguments. That it used to be possible to say, compare the Union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland with the Union of the European Union, and 10, 15 years ago, people would have been willing to consent to the idea that the European Union was modern. The European Union is modern, forward-looking, plural, shiny. It comes with lovely airports full of Danish chairs. It has other examples of regions successfully having devolved powers, like Catalonia, which once upon a time looked quite ambitious for the British setting. And on the other side, you have the rusty biscuit tin with the Queen Mother on it of the British Union. So naturally, you'd go for the Danish chairs rather than the
rusty biscuit tin.
Rather than the rusty biscuit tin. If, however, the British Union turns out to be, though rusty and battered and equivocal at the edges, turns out to be actually more serviceable than the thing with the shiny flag and the Danish chairs for now, then the mood music doesn't work properly anymore. But I think certainly in people kind of my age and my generation, there is a fundamental sense that there is something good about the cosmopolitanism of the European project. It feeds into my sense that the British Union is a good thing, to think that connection is good, diversity is good, pluralism is good, whereas separation and singleness are bad on the whole, and that for all its faults, the European Union is one embodiment of an international association which is supposed to stop war and get us used to being diverse and unified at the same time. I don't think it functions institutionally very well at the moment to do that, but it's not an ideal you can easily set aside, and it's a fact in our world. So we move slightly anxiously round it, wondering what place it should have in all sorts of different political hopes.
Any other questions?
I wondered, as writers for No, what attractions are there for creatives and people in the arts? Because singleness and separation seems bad to most people, but National Collective will tell you that there is a collective and it's cool, and you can be part of this thing that is together. They're almost campaigning in the same way as Better Together. Some of the things they say are very similar. So as writers for No, why should people in the arts ignore that in Scotland?
I should say I'm not a writer for No, because I'm not a Scot. I'm a writer for Please No. But yes, it's a serious question. From the English perspective, what is Scots about Scots literature is not in any danger of being diluted, limited, restricted, or underappreciated by being part of British literature. They feed, all of the literatures of the island feed each other. But then I'm looking at it from the south end of the island. Ken?
Well, to a certain extent, I'm not the best writer to ask, because being a science fiction writer, albeit a science fiction writer who has imagined more different future Scotlands than I think any other single writer ever has,
including independent ones frequently.
Yeah, I think that there is a remarkable concurrence in some parts of the Scottish arts scene for independence. Almost every writer, every fiction writer, seems to be in one degree or another. Perhaps not all the poets, and we've seen certainly not all the non-fiction writers, certainly not all the publishers, not all the musicians, and so on. There are the benefits for the culture, for the culture of Scotland, of being part of the Union, seem to me so screamingly obvious that it's difficult even to articulate them, because there is no sense in which Scottish culture as such is oppressed or diminished in the Union. There's a certain degree of, I think, there is a degree of the area in which you do get a degree of disdain for Scottish culture is when there's an element of class in it. Like, it's very true that some of the attitudes that were expressed about James Kelman 15, 20 odd years ago are, or more, were rooted in class rather than in nationality, I think. And the interesting thing is that the problem, for example, of Scottish kids, well, not so much the problem. What I mean is how liberating it is for Scottish kids or Scottish teenagers or young people generally to see on television or on film people talking in their own accents. This is very, very true, in recognisable versions of their own accents. But the same is true of children from virtually every part of England. You know, there is now, thanks to this multicultural melange of London, there's a kind, what is called, I think, the estuarine accent,
Yep.
which is rather different from the old Cockney accent. But the Cockney was as caricatured as the Jock in the old days, and as badly mangled from speech into print as any Glaswegian or Highlander. So there are certain historic frictions and grievances around that. But if you look at the literature as a whole, there's no question that Scottish literature has been part of British English literature, the literature of the English language. And when it comes to the minority languages, and the native minority languages of Scotland, Gaelic and Scots, most of the damage to them has been done by Scots, not by the English. So I think that the radicalism of writers and the often the unrealistic radicalism which appeals to writers is part of that.
I think I'd add to that so far as there was a grievance about voices, both literal voices and printed voices, it was because absolutely everybody in the British Isles who didn't have a voice that sounded like mine was pushed to the margins for a very long time in favour of a literature which aspired to sound like this is Alvar Liddell reading the news. But one of the things that British culture has managed quite successfully over the last 15 years is a kind of decentering of that voice. So thank God what I sound like now is just one of the voices of the island. Yes, I'm not saying that structures of privilege disappear with the wave of a magic wand, but that there is a radical openness to different voices now, and within that new British perceptual world, the Scottish clusters of voices seem distinctive and rather powerful to us. Ken talks modestly about perhaps being a science fiction writer, making it more complicated, but from the outside, one of the things that's very noticeable is that there has been an emergent cluster of very definitely and distinctively Scottish science fiction being written, which has a valuably different political centre to it, and a sense of political possibility which enriches the rest of the English-speaking world. It's quite weird to Americans in particular, I suspect, who thought that space opera belonged to them rather than to Ian Banks, who I really wish was part of this debate. I'm sure he'd have been on the yes side, but I would still...
Yes.
I'm sure he... But
of course.
I
Yes.
really wish he was part of the conversation.
Yes.
Sorry, I got sidetracked somewhere, but perhaps I'd finished.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have we reached an end or a conclusion?
No, we haven't, because the story of what it means to be British and sharing the damn island remains to be written ad infinitum. Even if political separation happens, which I profoundly hope it doesn't, then I hope we will remain mutually fertilising neighbours, but it would be much better and a bigger prospect for all of us if we could go on jostling each other with the same unit.
Well, I couldn't have put it better myself, so I won't try to. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for coming here tonight.